Dr. Moy Schwartz was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, he knew that he was terminally ill. And he had a student, Mitch Albom, who was a journalist. A former student of his would come see him every Tuesday. That's how they came up with the title Tuesdays with Maury. I think it's a great book, and in it they give a beautiful description of the practice of mindfulness that I think is related to grief and loss. And you have a copy of this at the top of your handout. They use the term detachment in this passage, and that's relevant because detachment is synonymous with the practice of mindfulness, and detachment means, in Western philosophy or cultures, we tend to think of detachment as a bad thing. If somebody's detached, they're aloof, they're cold, they're not present, they're disengaged. But in Asian philosophy, in mindfulness circles, detachment is actually a good thing. It's what you're hoping for. You could either say it's synonymous with mindfulness, or it's kind of the psychological fruits of mindfulness. And that's the passage I'll read now. And I think it's very applicable to our subject matter today. So this is Tuesdays with Maury. Don't cling to things, because everything is impermanent. But detachment doesn't mean you don't let the experience penetrate you. On the contrary, you let it penetrate you fully. That's how you are able to leave it. If you hold back on the emotions, if you don't allow yourself to go all the way through them, you can never get to being detached. You're too busy being afraid. You're afraid of the pain. You're afraid of the grief. You're afraid of the vulnerability that loving entails. But by throwing yourself into these emotions, by allowing yourself to dive in all the way, over your head even, you experience them fully and completely. You know what pain is. You know what love is. You know what grief is. And only then can you say, all right, I have experienced that emotion. I recognize that emotion. Now I need to detach from that emotion for a moment. I know you think this is just about dying, but it's like I keep telling you, when you learn how to die, you learn how to live. And that's from Tuesdays with Maury. I like that passage very much because I think it talks about the centrality of grief and loss. And I think it's a good metaphor. This talk we're giving is geared a little more towards oncology caregivers, and also caregivers as a whole. Maybe you're a caregiver for a loved one who has Alzheimer's or Lou Gehrig's disease. But I think it's also relevant. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about, I think, are relevant for cancer patients or people with chronic health challenges, as well as professionals, medical professionals, nurses and doctors, social workers, therapists. And I think one of the things I like about that passage, several things. One is that you probably have already heard this. We get a lot of negative messages about grief and loss. People will tell us, they'll kind of throw out these pat, contrived answers, and they're not actually being present to us in our grieving process. And I think sometimes we're a very death-denying society, and that doesn't help us. There's a great documentary that's called Except for Six. It was a little independent film, and it talks about patients in hospice care. And there's a scene at the beginning of the documentary. There's a med school professor, and he's up there giving a lecture to his first-year medical students. And he asks them a question every day on the first day of class. And the question is, what percentage of your patients will die? And you see him doing this, and he also describes the process. And his patients are very earnest and thoughtful. Obviously, they're smart. They're training to be physicians, and they kind of give the question a thoughtful reflection. And they say to themselves, well, they say things like, well, I'm going to work really hard, but some people die, or sometimes the technology won't work, or some things aren't curable, and they throw out estimates like 10% or 20%. And then he corrects them and he says, no, 100% of your patients will die sooner or later. We're all mortal beings, and that's the truth. And it's an important thing to know that death is universal for all of us, no matter who we are. It's a universal phenomenon, and yet it's despite being universal, and interestingly, despite being something that all religions, all systems of philosophy talk about, we often don't talk about it, unfortunately. And so one of the things that happens is something that's already hard can become even harder. And when people need help the most, they often don't get it. And that's understandably a big challenge. Um, when we're grieving, whether we're a patient or a caregiver, we can feel isolated. And then because of our kind of um, cultural denial of death, I think we often can be even more isolated than we would have to be. And it's interesting that there's a lot of research on grief and loss and our awareness of death. Kids start thinking about death at about 18 months old. So, kids will be at a park and they'll see a bird that's fallen out of a tree and died, or, their mom and dad is cutting the grass and maybe there was a cricket that got, killed by the lawnmower or something. Kids have an awareness of death. By the time children reach about the age of 18, they've seen over 1 million deaths on television. And that study, by the way, was done before the advent. That was back in the 90s, before the advent of internet culture. So it's worth considering how people learn about death, and maybe even for you, what were the things that you first learned about death? What formulated your views of it? What formulated your views of grief and loss? And how have those impacted you, and how have those impacted the circles that you're in and this cultural, societal factors that you're exposed to? And I think one of the big challenges, as we were saying just a second ago, is that people avoid talking about grief and loss. There was even an amazing study done by Robert Kastenbaum, who was a psychologist who died not too long ago. And he was doing a 5-year study at teaching hospitals. So these are like really excellent hospitals. They're up on the latest research. And he was monitoring the nurses and the physicians for specific factors. One of which was, once a patient was diagnosed as being terminally ill, how much time did those physicians and those nurses spend with their patients? And interestingly, they found a lot of key things. One, once a patient was designated as being terminally ill, maybe they had a cancer that had metastasized and was no longer curable, for example, the doctors and the nurses would spend less time with their patients. Also, people's treatment decisions often weren't honored, even sometimes when there were advanced directives, things about artificial life-sustaining treatment, ventilators, that sort of thing. And also, sometimes people were in pain that could have been prevented medically but was not. For example, maybe they weren't in hospice care, something like that. And one of the keys to know with that study is that, well, so they repeated the study. 2 years into the study, Robert Kastenbaum gathered up this evidence. He presented it to these physicians and nurses, and he presented the results of the study. And the physicians and the nurses were like, "Oh, we're going to do better." Like, they knew the data wasn't good, and they said, "We're going to do better." And then he repeated the study and they didn't do any better on any of those markers. And it's not that they're lazy. It's not that they don't care. I've worked in healthcare my entire career, and I think most people go into healthcare because they really want to do good in the world. They really want to help people. But it's an extremely stressful job. People can get burnout. There's a lot of pressure in it. It's a litigious field. And also, as a caregiver, a professional caregiver, and of course as a patient and family member, you're facing the seminal challenges of human existence on a daily basis. And that can be extremely challenging. And the reason I mention that, we're going to spend most of our time talking about grief and loss today, but I mention that because one thing about the grieving process that we don't talk about is the context in which people die. And if people get good pain and symptom management, maybe they're in a palliative care program or a hospice program, they get good holistic psychosocial support. Dying is never easy, but if their treatment decisions are honored, they're well informed of their options, their cultural background is taken into account, they get good holistic support, the dying process is going to be easier, and the grieving process will consequently be easier as well. So if you're grieving, there may be some things from the care your loved one received that might present some challenges to work through in your grieving process. So I think those are kind of how the loved one you have in your life, how they died, might affect the context of your grieving. I think too, we're a death denying society for sure. And I think one of the challenges of that is that caregivers often get kind of left by the wayside, even more than the patients. And of course, understandably, our loved one who has, a metastatic cancer, an incurable form of cancer, some cancers can metastasize and be cured, but our loved one, understandably, the patient is going to be the central focus. That only makes sense. But I think it's also important to say that there's some research for some conditions, especially long-term chronic conditions that are incurable. Sometimes caregivers have shorter life expectancies than the patients themselves. And I do a lot of group therapy for patients who are terminally ill, caregivers of someone who's terminally ill, and then also group therapy for people who, say, lost a spouse. And I can't tell you how many times in my work I've heard patients say, the patient who's terminally ill say, you know what? This is actually harder on my spouse. This is actually harder on my family than it is on me. And for sure, it's not about setting up a hierarchy. It's not about comparing who has the harder situation. I don't think that's skillful, but I do offer that because I think we're a death-denying society, and particularly related to that, people who are caregivers often get neglected. And caregiving it's kind of like you're trying to sprint a marathon. It's a full-time job, and it's very hard to get a break. And of course, it's sacred work. Of course, you want to be there for your loved one, and it's very, very hard. So one thing I think about being a caregiver is taking some type of self-care some of the time, even if it's just a momentary practice for 5 seconds, contemplative prayer, meditation, kind of mindfully petting your dog or cat. Even taking tiny little breaks is helpful. And as you care for yourself, you are also caring for the person you love. Doing some kind of caregiving for yourself is not selfish. It's actually very necessary. I say this a lot as a psychologist to my colleagues in mental health. I'll say good self-care equals good clinical care. And I think that's true for caregivers as well. When we think about grieving, I think there's a good model that's provided by the psychiatrist William Worden, and he kind of talks about 4 phases of the grieving process. The first is, and I think about this even when I'm providing grief counseling, the first is, and I think that this can be true for many different situations, many different forms of loss, but often when someone we love dies, the first phase is a state of shock, a state of numbness, a kind of trippiness in a way. The world just doesn't make sense. And even getting to the point where we can acknowledge this kind of terrible and tremendous new normal takes time. A good example of that, I think, is the book Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking. And she talks about her husband dying, and they were both writers, they worked from home, they were together all the time, and her husband died. And she called it magical thinking, and she would she would do things like make enough coffee for both of them, and then she would remember, oh, my husband died. Or I think she set out his slippers, and then she would remember, oh yes, my husband died. And there's a way that when someone we love dies, it's such a kind of shock and seminal change in our life. It takes a while before we can even kind of acknowledge that that's happened. And that may seem strange, but it's actually quite normal. If you think your loved one is alive, if you forget that they've died, you're not crazy. It's actually quite a normal experience. Um, Death can make beginners of us all, especially, by the way, if you're a professional caregiver. Maybe you're a nurse or a therapist or a physician, social worker, because you're kind of a grief expert. And I say this even from personal experience. And then when you lose someone you love, you might be surprised at the intensity of your loss. And you might think, oh, I've done this work for decades. Why am I grieving? Well, a lot of times when we grieve, we don't just grieve the person we love or that we're thinking about in the immediate moment, but we can also sometimes re-grieve these past losses as well. And sometimes, especially if you're a professional caregiver in a hospital, for example, or a hospice or a therapist, all those other losses are going to come up as well. And you can have vicarious trauma, you can experience other losses along the way that hit you in a seminal moment. So this first phase that William Worden talks about is just kind of the shock phase, getting to the point where you can even acknowledge and recognize that this has happened. And I want to say too, as I propose this model, I'm not saying that it's linear, it's not a math formula, it's not sequential. The healing process is often circuitous. It's kind of a back and forth process, especially when it comes to things like grief. Sometimes we can take one step forward and two steps back, or one step kind of diagonally forward and then two steps diagonally back, or it can feel like we're circling. I think with the grieving process too, especially in a counseling setting, the next thing you might think about is moving through and processing the emotions. And that's one of the reasons I love that passage from Tuesdays with Maury. You know what pain is, you know what grief is, you know what love is. When you're grieving someone that you love, you're going to feel a kind of almost infinite array of emotions. Fear, sadness, you might be angry, you might have emotions that have no rational explanation. We're not just logical thinking beings, we're also emotional beings, and our emotions aren't always rational. You might feel numbness, you might feel attraction to someone new physically, and then you might feel shame that you felt attracted. And it's not that you need to feel shame, there's no need for shame. Love is good, but we're just processing the emotions of losing the person that we love. And and that can take time. It's a process, and we'll talk about coping too more in just a second. I think another phase of the grieving process or grief counseling is thinking about logistics. And that's one that gets downplayed, but is really, really important. Let's use ourselves as an example, or I'll use myself as an example. So I'm married. My wife is the computer person in our marriage. She used to be a computer programmer. She's really good at that stuff. If my wife were to die tomorrow, I would have a very hard time, not just from the emotional piece, which of course is supremely important, but I don't know how to do computers and set up the internet and all that kind of stuff. And that's just one example of, in our families, in our relationships, we all have roles that we play, skills that we contribute. And I've talked with people who are like, I had to learn how to cook, or now I'm just cooking for one person. The raw logistics of budgeting, finance, home care, all these kind of things, we're no longer doing them in a family system. We're no longer having our partner there with us. The raw logistics, settling an estate, all that kind of stuff is a huge part. And a therapist, family and friends, they can play an important role in helping with that as well. And then also the kind of fourth stage of related to grief counseling is or healing from grief, is thinking about the trajectory of our life. What do we want to do now? I always caution people, it's good to avoid making serious decisions when you're in a grieving state. If you can put off big life decisions, but what do you want the tapestry of your life to look like now? Let's say, for example, you have a spouse who's died. If you're in your 20s, that may look one way. If you're in your 70s, that may look a different way. Of course, people can find love and passion at all ages of their life, but what do you want the fabric of your life to look like now? What is your purpose? Why are you here? What do you want the tapestry of your life to look like? So again, often when I'm providing grief therapy, kind of four of the dimensions I think about, and I do want to stress this is not linear, but there's the idea of shock, just that initial overwhelming state of shock and surge of unreality that we experience when someone we love dies. Then there's kind of moving through and processing the emotion. And then also thinking about the logistics, which is a neglected form of the grieving process that we tend not to think about, but anybody who's lost a loved one will say, yes. Thinking about those kind of logistical concerns was a huge factor. And then also thinking about what do we want our life to look like now? So that's a little bit about, I think, what kind of grief counseling looks like and the kind of raw process of grieving. In terms of how do we cope, it's important to acknowledge right up front that we have a rich tapestry of multicultural backgrounds. People have different religions, different forms of spirituality, different ways of coping for sure. I do think some things that are universal is one, we do need some type of guide. And that form of guide can be a lot of different things. Maybe it's a friend or a family member who's been through a similar process. Maybe it's a therapist. Maybe it's a minister. Maybe you're reading, writers like, Tuesdays with Morrie with Mitch Albom or Irv Yalom or Robert Kastenbaum. There are lots of things that can be our teacher, but we all need support and guidelines. And that's an important thing too, because, and I'm going to come back to this idea in a second, we all need support. Asking for support doesn't mean you're weak. It actually means you're insightful and strong. It takes courage to ask for help, quite frankly. And we all need help sometimes, for sure. So I think one key component of coping is some type of guide or fellow traveler, people who will be fully present to you in the kind of infinite sea of emotions and experiences you're having when you're grieving. Second, I think we need a kind of twofold thing. One, some type of philosophy or beliefs. This may or may not be religion. It could be spirituality. It could be philosophy. There's this lovely quote, I don't remember the exact words, but from Albert Einstein. It's on my website somewhere, but Albert Einstein expressed the idea. He was speaking at a funeral for a friend of his, and he talked about how he felt through his study of physics and science, he felt so interconnected to everyone in the universe that he feared not the passing of any being, including himself. So science, nature, philosophy, religion, there's a lot of great sources of support. And these aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. You can have more than one teacher, more than one system of meaning, but life can be hard. There's also really great things in the world, but especially when you're grieving, you're going to be understandably clued into the harder things of life. And so you want to ground yourself in the good as much as possible. And similarly, having some type of system of philosophy, system of spirituality, religion, meaning making, something that helps you understand the world is a very powerful thing. So in addition, though, to that kind of system of philosophy or core beliefs, I think we do need practices. Ideas are very powerful, beliefs are very powerful, but we all probably know people in our lives who embody and manifest the truths that they believe in. I don't know, maybe that's somebody like Nelson Mandela or the Dalai Lama or Desmond Tutu or Mother Teresa, Maya Angelou, the poet. But we need, in other words, we're not just kind of cognitive neurological creatures, we're behavioral interpersonal creatures. And what things do we do to make our beliefs and our philosophy a lived experiential reality? When the rubber hits the road, when we've lost someone we love, what is it that make these ideas lived experiential realities? Maybe that's meditation, maybe it's contemplative prayer, maybe it's mindfulness, which is one form of meditation, maybe it's long distance running, maybe it's a group therapy, a contemplative prayer group, art therapy. It's again, these aren't mutually exclusive. You can have more than one practice, and I encourage that. And on that note too, a great resource, I didn't list it on my resource list, but it is a good one. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk. Very famous book, good book. You can also get it as an audio book. It's on trauma and grief, losing someone we love, watching someone we love die can be traumatic in the clinical sense. And Bessel van der Kolk wrote a very important book on trauma itself. And the title of the book is The Body Keeps the Score. And that's the title of the book says it well, because we think of grief and trauma as primarily psychological phenomenon. For sure, they are psychological. They're thoughts we have, emotions we have, but we also experience grief and trauma in our bodies as a physical reality. When you have something traumatic happen to you, there are sometimes neurological changes in terms of neurotransmitters that you produce. There are physical things that happen in your body, and that traumatic event, those kind of conditioned responses, both neurologically and physically in our body, just like an athlete develops muscle memory, you can kind of get those conditioned neurological and physiological responses conditioned into you. And then they can get triggered with reminders of this traumatic grief event. And so the body keeps the score. The first part of the book is all about kind of a technical explanation of what happens with trauma. The second part of the book, and I think of this in terms of grief and loss, is because he has all these wonderful chapters on things like meditation, exercise, cardiovascular exercise, yoga, art therapy, drama therapy. And the idea is that, kind of like when somebody is doing chemotherapy and you flush that chemo out of your system, or you flush toxins out of your system, when you do things like long distance running, cycling, swimming, equine therapy. There's been studies for military veterans who've had trauma, surfing, and feeling the waves of the ocean wash over their bodies and the kind of gravitational pull that the ocean exerts. Any of these kind of practices, yoga, tai chi, qigong, walking meditation, those are literally kind of healing practices in your body, reversing the effects of that grief or that trauma. Kind of like medicine, quite frankly. And Bessel van der Kolk does a very good job looking at the research on the benefits of those kind of practices. So again, when we think about coping, we've talked a little bit about what the phases of grief look like through William Worden's model. And now thinking about coping a little bit. Again, one, we need some type of guide. Maybe that's books, spirituality, priests or ministers, therapists. They're not mutually exclusive, but there are other people who have experienced things like we have experienced. And that alone can be very comforting, because grief can be very isolating. Then I think we need both a system of philosophy or spirituality, meaning making, a way to make sense of the world, especially when something so painful has happened. And then similarly, practices, maybe meditation, mindfulness, contemplative prayer, any of the things Bessel van der Kolk talks about, exercise, art therapy, drama therapy, the arts themselves, movie, film, music can be very healing, but we need practices to make our ideas, our core beliefs, lived experiential realities. And the final thing I want to say is we need community. No person is an island. We all need support. And there's a lot of great ways to get community. Maybe it's through a church, mosque, synagogue. Maybe it's through a running club, a knitting club, a music band that you listen to or play with, group therapy. There's all kinds of ways to find community, but community matters, and it matters a lot. And I would say too that with grief, some kind of other notes on grief that I want to offer. The grieving process is good. It's not that we want people to be sad, but grieving is a normal, natural response. We grieve physically, in addition to our emotions and our thoughts. Grief is part of the healing process. Miles Davis, this great jazz musician, he once said when he heard the blues, he didn't get sad. He actually felt happy because when he listened to the blues, it was a reminder that help is on the way. And so when you're grieving, that is part of the healing process. And it's important to know, too, that part of the reason we grieve is because we've loved so deeply that we had the courage to commit to a relationship, to invest ourselves in a relationship over time, to sacrifice, to receive support and love, and to provide support and love. And that's part of the reason we're grieving, because we have loved so deeply. So it's not that we want people to suffer, and it's not that we want people to grieve, but part of the reason we grieve is because we've loved in the first place. You know, we've had this seminal relationship, and now this relationship has at least changed or shifted in a profound way. And that's why we're grieving. If someone doesn't grieve, and that's sometimes, or someone isn't sad when someone dies, and that is the case, there are abusive relationships out there. But if someone isn't grieving, that's a different set of questions and challenges. So your grief is normal and natural and even healthy. An analogy I use sometimes with the idea of grief is the idea of a vase. Let's say you have a beautiful, beautiful vase, and then that vase gets dropped, because sometimes beautiful vases get dropped. Sometimes good things happen. I'm sorry, sometimes bad things happen to good people. You know, we're all mortal beings. You didn't do anything wrong. Your loved one didn't deserve to die. We're all mortal beings. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so one analogy I like is I use the analogy of a vase in terms of healing and grief. Sometimes a beautiful vase will get dropped now and get broken. You can get duct tape and you can wrap that vase up, and so that if it gets dropped in the future, because we may get dropped in the future, now that that vase is kind of ensconced in duct tape, it'll be even more resilient and even stronger. And if it gets dropped the next time, it'll be stronger and it may not even crack. Or you can get crazy glue and you can glue that vase up again. And now, because of a result of its healing through crazy glue, it can maybe hold more water at a higher volume of pressure. In other words, the vase is more able to fulfill its purpose of vaseness as a result of the healing process. We can emerge stronger. We can emerge with an even more clear sense of purpose in our lives. We talk about post-traumatic stress in our society. There's also post-traumatic growth in our society. And interestingly, we talk a lot more about post-traumatic stress than post-traumatic growth, but they're both present. And so with the vase analogy, you can get wrapped up in duct tape and be even stronger as you recover. You can be, using crazy glue and glue the vase back together, and it can hold more water at a higher volume of pressure, and that vase is even stronger in its purpose. This is the grieving process. We can emerge more whole. We can emerge more resilient and more grounded in our process. It is a process. And we're going to open it up for question and answers. And I want to talk about the resource list I provided you with, but before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to read one last passage for you. And this is written by a Jewish Rabbi Robert Kahn, and it's called Tears of the Proof of Life. And it's a good description of, I think, the grieving process. How long will the pain last? A broken-hearted mourner asked me. All the rest of your life, I had to answer truthfully. We never quite forget. No matter how many years pass, we remember. The loss of a loved one is like a major operation. Part of us is removed, and we have a scar for the rest of our lives. This does not mean that the pain continues at the same intensity. There is a short while at first when we hardly believe it. It is rather like when we have cut our hand. We see the blood flowing, but the pain is not set in yet. So when we are bereaved, there is a short while before the pain hits us, but when it does, it is massive in its effects. Grief is shattering. Then the wounds begin to heal. It is like going through a dark tunnel. Occasionally, we glimpse a bit of light up ahead, then lose sight of it a while, then see it again. And one day we emerge into the light. We are able to laugh, to care, to live. The wound is healed. The stitches are taken out, and we are whole again. But not quite. The scar is still there, and the scar tissue too. As the years go by, we manage. There are things to do, people to care for, tasks that call for full attention, but the pain is still there, not far below the surface. We see a face that looks familiar, hear a voice that has echoes, see a photograph in someone's album, see a landscape that once we saw together, and it is as though the knife were in the wound again, but not so painfully, and mixed with joy too, because remembering a happy time is not all sorrow. It brings back happiness with it. As a matter of fact, we even see such moments of bittersweet remembrance. We have our religious memories and our memorial days and our visits to the cemetery. And though these bring back the pain, they bring back memories of joy as well. How long will the pain last? All the rest of your life. But the thing to remember, not only the pain will last, but the blessed memories as well. Tears are the proof of love. The more love, the more tears. If this be true, then how could we ever ask that the pain cease altogether? For then the memory of love would go with it. The pain of grief is the price we pay for love. And that's Tears of the Proof of Love. So I want to open it up to questions with the audience, and I also want to take a moment to talk about the handout. Do we have some questions that have been posted, Natalie?
Yeah, so David, thank you so much for that presentation. All of the information was so useful and really a good reminder. I actually have several questions that I would like to share with you and have you respond. But I would also like to take a minute to say that I had a few technical difficulties in the beginning. So I want to remind the audience that in your control panel, you do have a tab for handouts. And Dr. Zuniga has done such a nice job of putting some handouts together for us. So please take advantage of those, open them up, download them, save them. And so thank you for that. And then Dr. Zuniga, I'm going to do something a little out of order, but this is because I had a little glitch in the beginning. Would you just introduce yourself and your background? Because we did not capture that. And I would love everyone who is on the call to hear that.
Sure. So real quick, I actually started my career. I went to Harvard Divinity School, studied comparative religion, and I worked for probably 15 years as an interfaith chaplain in palliative care, hospice care with children and adults, pediatric and adult patients, and oncology, primarily end-stage oncology. And then I went back to school and became a clinical psychologist. So all my career, I've worked in end-of-life care.
Thank you so much for redoing that for us. Okay, so I have several questions. So let's see if we can get through all of them. And if we cannot, maybe we can find a way to do some follow-up questions, but let's try to get through them. Okay, so one of the questions I received from the audience is, what do I say to others when they tell me it's time to move on, but I'm really not feeling that way? They don't feel that it's time to move on, but their friends and loved ones are saying, hey, it's time. How would you address that, I guess, for that person?
Excellent question. That's a question that comes up all the time. Kind of like we were saying at the beginning of the presentation. Unfortunately, we're a death-denying society. And so a lot of times when people say things like that, like, oh, you need to get over it, even if they're well-intentioned, a lot of times they've just been taught to say that, or sometimes when people say that, that's more about them and not about you. Like they may be uncomfortable being around someone who's grieving. Maybe it brings up their own stuff. They don't know what to say. In terms of response, I encourage you to say whatever feels good, whatever feels skillful for you in the moment. How much energy and time do you want to invest in that exchange or that relationship? You do have a right to say, hey, you know what? Grieving is a normal, natural process. I'm grieving because I loved so profoundly. Um, I think the best way to consider your answer to that question is what's the least stressful thing for you in the moment? Sometimes you may want to engage the person, and sometimes you may not want to, and that's okay too. You have a right to talk about things when you want to talk about them, and you also have a right not to talk about them if sometimes you don't feel like it or you don't feel safe. But I always tell this to my clients, hey, when you talk about your grief, that's a gift. I've spent my entire career around end of life concerns, grief and loss. And part of the reason I do that is because the very fact that our lives are short, the very fact that our time is limited on this earth forces us to ask the question, how do we want to live? What is the most important things to us, our values, what we're about? And so when you choose to share your grief with people, that's actually a gift.
Great. I think that's so great. So on the flip side, another question we received is so if I am a caregiver or a friend of somebody, what do I say to my friend who is dealing with grief?
Yeah, I think that's another great question that we get that comes up a lot. I think the best thing to say is to first listen. Try and be aware of their religion or spirituality if they have that. Try and be aware of the cultural context which informs them. But I think the very best thing to say is before we say anything, to first just listen and to be present. And just your presence and your authentic compassion speaks volume. I'd be hesitant on offering too many suggestions, or I'd definitely be hesitant on giving too much advice because everybody's unique. One thing that will never serve you wrong is, hey, I'm sorry. I'm just so sorry. And you can also say, what can I do to help? That can be nice. Or even sometimes you can make a suggestion, like maybe if it's a neighbor on your street or somebody in your church, for example. You say, hey, can I bring you a meal? Or, you know, can we have lunch together? And then I think the most important thing is not so much what we say, but our raw presence with the person. Being available to listen if they want to listen, being willing to sit with them if they're crying. Crying is completely normal, natural, and in fact, crying can even be cathartic, and we feel better after we cry and get those emotions out. And I think the most important thing is just the spaciousness to let people say or not say what they want to say or what they don't. Maybe they don't want to talk about their grief. Maybe they want to talk about a football game or, talk about something besides their grief, or maybe they really want to explore it. And being available for that full tapestry of experiences, I think, is the most important thing.
I think that's all really, those are great tips. I guess along those same lines, if you do notice somebody really struggling with a
Yeah.
loss, how do you encourage somebody dealing with a loss or grief to find, like, what I guess maybe what are the signs that maybe they need help beyond a friend? Maybe they need some type of intervention and professional help. How do you encourage somebody dealing with that to seek help?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So there's kind of twofold question there. One is, how do you know when you need help? And then the second one is, how do you encourage people to seek help? The first one, in terms of how do you know when people need help, the basic thing I would look at is, first off, I think we all need help when we lose someone we love. I mean, I'm a psychologist who specializes in grief and loss, and I feel devastated by I have a family member in a hospice right now, and my mom, who's always been my best friend, has Alzheimer's. We all need support when we're grieving, and that's not a sign. And this is one way to encourage people to get support is like some specific things I've said, and some of the language I've used in this presentation is, hey, you know what? It takes courage to ask for help. It takes strength to ask for help. We all need support. And part of it is in the United States, there's a lot of great things about the United States. And the United States is actually very culturally diverse in a lot of ways. But the United States in particular does tend to, I'm assuming most of the people who are listening in on this are from the United States. But the United States is a very individualistic society compared to other society. And that has probably pros and cons. But I think sometimes we can be less likely to reach out for support. So the first thing I would say is everybody needs support. It's not a sign of weakness, not a sign of deficiency. It's actually a sign of insight and courage and strength. Also, getting, say, professional counseling, for example. Counseling isn't just about things like depression or anxiety or trauma. It's also about wellness. Counseling can be about spirituality and self-actualization and positive psychology, um, or meditation and stuff. It can be about all kinds of things. Um, and sometimes even kind of being aware of the person's cultural context can be helpful. Let me give two examples. Um, in Christianity, if I can use that as an example, Jesus wept in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus cried at the seminal moment of Christianity when Jesus was on the cross. He cried. He asked if the cup could be taken from him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Even Jesus wanted help, according to the Bible. Or the Buddha, according to Buddhist mythology, the whole reason the Buddha came up with mindfulness meditation was because he himself was afraid of the fact that he would get sick, he would get older, and he would eventually die. So I say to people sometimes, I'm like, well, if the Buddha and Jesus were afraid of dying, it's okay to be afraid of dying, or it's okay to grieve. It's normal and natural and healthy. So kind of being aware of their cultural context can also be helpful. I think in terms of when do you need help, again, I think we all need help, but we all, and that's a sign of strength. But the other thing I would say is when you've lost someone you love, you might have some trouble sleeping. You might have some fatigue. You might have some difficulty concentrating. You will feel sad. Those emotions are all normal and natural. I would say if things start to feel, we never want to minimize people's emotions. We have a right to our emotions. And similarly, another great thing about our emotions is that they're kind of dating. If we're feeling big sadness or fear, for example, or anger, that might be a sign that things are kind of out of balance. Similarly, if think about the way that grief is impacting your life. How long is this lasting? And I do think grieving is actually a lifelong process, like that poem Tears of the Proof of Life says. But also, is it affecting your ability to work or to go to school? Is it impacting your ability to fulfill major important roles in your life, like in relationships, things you do in the community? If your kind of role, work, important relationships, or domains of your life are being severely impacted over a prolonged period of time, that definitely might be a sign to get support. And there's a lot of good forms of support out there, but counseling is one skillful way. Group therapy is kind of more rare, but I do a lot of group therapy. Local hospitals, I believe all hospitals, I think nationwide, are required to provide some type of bereavement support. And a lot of hospices, like one in where I live in Austin, Hospice Austin, they have wonderful therapy groups or support groups, which are often free of charge for people in the community. So your local hospice organizations can be a good source of support as well. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, great question.
Yeah, that's great. So listen, we have about 4 more minutes, but I do have two other questions, and they're great questions. All the questions are great, so I want to see if we can get to them. Can you generally just kind of give a general thought to anticipatory grief?
Yeah, absolutely. Such an important thing. And both patients and caregivers can experience that. By the way, as well as professional caregivers, just to put that
Right.
out too. I mean, I'll say for myself as a psychologist, and I've worked in for over 20 years in end of life care, grief and loss, people with terminal illnesses. I mean, I've had patients when they die or they get diagnosed as being terminally ill, and it devastated. And so I've geared this a little more towards caregivers like family members, but let's not neglect clinicians. You all do important work and it can be very hard. So please engage in self-care. But anticipatory grief is a neglected phenomenon and it's a very important one. I have had many patients who said, say for caregivers, from the perspective of a caregiver, you know, of course they don't want their loved one to die. No one wants their loved one to die. But one of the fruits that may come from this tremendously hard process is you can start to move through the emotions. That's why all forms of grieving are hard. I don't like to create hierarchies of suffering, but one of the reasons sudden death is so hard, like if somebody dies in a car crash or a crime or a heart attack, is that we often have no time to prepare. One of the ideas of anticipatory grief is we can begin to work out those emotions. And even those things that like William Worden talks about, like logistics, we can start working. Do we have a will in place? Have we done financial planning? All that kind of stuff. But anticipatory grief is something that gets neglected, and it's very important. How are we preparing for this eventuality? Patients can have that as well. And I do think one of the most important things is getting good support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to be a common theme amongst all of these questions. So I think I have one last question, and then I will wrap it up. But gosh, we could sit here and just keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the last few questions, I'll just group them together, but it has to deal with children and loss. And so I'll just give you the two questions in one. How do you speak to children about loss? And this is interesting, should a child attend a funeral?
Excellent questions, and I get asked those a lot, and that almost makes me think we need a separate webinar for that.
I agree with you.
In brief, and it's hard to be brief in a way, because when we talk about death, yeah, we're also talking about life. Again, one of the fruits of thinking about end of life issues is it clarifies what's most important to us and how we want to live our life. In brief, I'll say with kids, I've worked a lot with kids in grieving situations. One, kids get neglected. Two, we often want to shelter kids, but that usually doesn't help. Kids are a lot smarter than we realize, and they know what's going on, even if we're trying to shelter them from it. Also, kids are way more resilient than we give them credit for. There's a lot of research on this. Of course, we don't want to see a child lose a parent or a sibling. No one wants to see that, or see a child who's dying. And yet, all of these things will happen. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. The research clearly shows that as long as kids get good support, counseling, loving family members, kids who lose a loved one can actually emerge much more whole, much more self-actualized, much more self-confident, able to cope, all those kind of things, because they've learned to integrate one of the seminal universalities of human existence into their life from an early age. And in a positive way, it can help shape them. In terms of a funeral, I say talk about it with the child, and almost always I say let the child decide. But usually kids do want to go to a funeral, and usually that's a concrete way of coping and starting the healing process. The last thing I'll say is there's a lot of great resources out there. Please check out the handout I provided. Also, please feel free to check out my website. I try to make it a free community resource for these exact kind of things. There's thousands of books, web links, over 2 hours of original and free videos of guided meditation. So feel free to check out my website as well. And thank you so much for being a part of this discussion.
Yay, thank you so much, Dr. Zuniga. We are just so appreciative of your time and knowledge. Everyone on the webinar, this will conclude our webinar. Thank you so much for participating. Check out TexasOncologyFoundation.org, and underneath our programs tab, you will see all of our upcoming Survive and Thrive symposiums and future webinars. So definitely please check that out. And I appreciate you all for attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much.